I've watched politicians for most of my adult life. I've seen them stumble when the pressure rises. I've seen them dodge direct questions, hide behind rehearsed talking points, and shift blame the moment the conversation turns uncomfortable. I've watched leaders collapse under the weight of their own contradictions. So when I say this next part stopped me cold, I don't say it lightly. What unfolded in Canada recently didn't look like the politics we've grown used to, especially south of the border. It wasn't noisy, it wasn't theatrical. There was no chest-thumping, no outrage performance, no manufactured drama designed for viral clips. Instead, there was something far more unsettling for anyone accustomed to political chaos. Calm competence. Mark Carney's year-end interview didn't feel like an interview at all. It felt like a strategic briefing. A leader speaking as though he understood the moment he was in and exactly where he wanted to take his country next. And in the current climate, that alone is disruptive. The contrast with American political culture couldn't have been sharper, and it's impossible to ignore the feeling that this contrast wasn't accidental. Carney wanted it seen, he wanted it noticed, by Washington, by Donald Trump, and by Americans watching from afar. Early in the conversation, the interviewer cut straight to the core issue. With Trump facing mounting legal uncertainty, looming court rulings on tariffs, and increasing political turbulence, was Canada's real strategy simply to wait, to let time and American dysfunction do the work? Most leaders would have sidestepped that question. They would have wrapped themselves in diplomatic language, talked vaguely about dialogue, cooperation, and respecting democratic processes. Carney didn't. His response was measured and devastatingly clear. Canada's strategy, he explained, is not to rush into a bad deal. Discipline matters. Patience matters. And then he delivered the line that revealed everything about Canada's approach. With every passing week, Canada strengthens itself at home and deepens its relationships abroad. Think about what that actually means. He wasn't saying Canada is stalling. He was saying Canada is advancing. Time in this equation isn't a liability, it's leverage. Patience isn't weakness. Patience is power. What made the moment even more striking was what Carney didn't do. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't threaten retaliation. He didn't insult or posture. He simply stated a reality and allowed the implications to settle on their own. While Canada builds capacity, expands trade networks, and diversifies alliances, the United States remains locked in cycles of uncertainty, legal battles, policy reversals, markets reacting to impulsive statements made before sunrise. Carney didn't need to spell that out. The contrast spoke for itself. And that's the mark of sophisticated leadership. Sometimes the strongest message is the one you never explicitly state. Then came a policy revelation that deserves far more attention than it has received. Carney spoke about defense spending, specifically Canada's plan to invest roughly $80 billion into its military capabilities. But the real story wasn't the amount, it was the direction of that spending. For decades, Canada relied heavily on the United States for defense procurement. According to Carney, nearly 70 cents of every defense dollar flowed south to American contractors. That arrangement reflected trust, shared values, a belief that the partnership was stable and dependable. That assumption no longer holds. Carney made it clear that those days are ending. Defense investment will now prioritize Canadian industry, Canadian manufacturing, Canadian innovation, not as a symbolic gesture, but as a strategic necessity. This isn't about hardware alone, it's about sovereignty. It's about a country recognizing dependence on an unpredictable partner carries unacceptable risk. And when your closest ally begins planning around you instead of with you, that's not a tantrum, it's a warning. This shift signals something deeper than a policy tweak. It reflects a fundamental reassessment of trust. Canada is actively reducing its reliance on the United States across economic, military, and political dimensions, not out of hostility, but out of prudence. They're building alternatives because they believe they must.
That reality should give Americans pause. When the nation sharing your longest undefended border decides it needs contingency plans for you, something has gone profoundly wrong. Then came a moment that revealed just how unusual Canada's political climate has become under this leadership. Carney disclosed that members of the Conservative Party, longtime political opponents, have crossed the aisle to support his government. Not through backroom deals, not through incentives or promises. They approached him. That distinction matters. Party switching isn't unheard of, but voluntary alignment driven by national interest rather than political advantage is rare. It suggests that the gravity of the moment has overridden partisan loyalty. In Canada, politicians who disagree ideologically are deciding that stability matters more than sectional warfare. It's hard not to compare that to the American landscape, where tribalism has hardened to the point that cooperation is often treated as betrayal. The idea of lawmakers prioritizing governance over spectacle feels almost unimaginable. Yet there it was, happening in real time. Carney acknowledged the irony of his own evolution. He didn't enter public life as a politician. He entered as a pragmatist, a central banker, a crisis manager, and now he wears both titles. That combination is rare. Many politicians master campaigns but struggle with governing. They know how to provoke outrage, but not how to resolve complexity. Carney comes from a different tradition, one focused on systems, trade-offs, and long-term planning, and it shows. 9 months into his tenure, he stated plainly that Canada is in a stronger position than when he took office. The economy is improving, a strategy is in motion, international credibility is rising. It didn't sound like spin, it sounded like assessment. And then came perhaps the most consequential insight of the entire interview. Carney explained that countries around the world are actively seeking deeper engagement with Canada, not hypothetically, concretely. Asian economies, Southeast Asia, Europe, the Gulf states. And then he dropped a figure that reframed everything. The United Arab Emirates has committed $70 billion in investment into Canada, voluntarily, without being solicited. That number should land heavily, because it signals a shift in global confidence. For decades, the United States was the default destination for capital, partnerships, and long-term bets. Stability, predictability, and institutional trust were America's greatest strategic assets. Carney's remarks suggest that perception is changing. Global actors are recalculating. They're comparing volatility with steadiness, impulsiveness with discipline, and increasingly they're choosing Canada, not because it's perfect, but because it's reliable. Trust, once lost, doesn't vanish overnight. It migrates. And that may be the most uncomfortable truth embedded in this entire conversation. This interview wasn't about Trump alone. It wasn't even about tariffs or trade. It was about credibility and who still has it. Canada, quietly and methodically, is positioning itself as a stable alternative in a world exhausted by uncertainty. And the longer this contrast remains visible, the harder it will be to ignore. Because leadership doesn't always announce itself with noise. Sometimes it speaks calmly and lets the world draw its own conclusions.